So, testing. If you can hear me, tell me. If you can't, tell me, and we will take it from there. So, I was saying, wonderful. People are saying they can hear me. I was saying that in this video, which I'm reshooting because it was going viral and people were taking it out of context, I want to be absolutely clear that while I am talking about the medical pandemic of coronavirus, it is a real medical emergency. It is something we all need to do everything possible to get under control, do appropriate things in terms of health, masks, social distancing, and so on. But what I'm going to be explaining is how nonetheless, and here I really need you to be grown-ups, and I need you to keep two thoughts in your mind at the same time, right? Something can be a real emergency, a real pandemic, and be used, exploited, as crises are, by elected officials and leaders in advanced democracies to strip us of the last of our liberties as citizens. So this is not medical policy, all right? I'm asking you just to think about civil liberties, and then the medical policy should flow out of an enlightened, free electorate thinking together about a crisis, all right? What I am warning you about is that the policy is not coming from citizens. It is not coming to us in the way that people create community policy, even about very serious medical emergencies in a crisis. It is coming to us the way leaders assign social policies in a closed society. So if everyone really truly understands that, I am not anti-mask, I am not anti-vax, I am calling your attention to where the policies are coming from, how they're being rolled out, and noting that the way decisions are being made is the way decisions are being made in closed societies. And so what that means is when the pandemic is over, these policies are not going to go away. And under cover of this medical emergency, in various countries, including Australia, Great Britain, that just had enabling clauses, which were literally how the National Socialists in the early 30s seized power lawfully. They are enabling clauses that do an end run around the parliamentary process. In Australia, the aspects of the parliamentary process have been weakened. New powers have been given to unelected committees. And in the United States, you're starting to see the same things from the left and the right. This using of the crisis to create central decision-making about economies, about trillions of dollars, about what winners or losers are in an economy, which is exactly what a socialist or a totalitarian or a fascist society does, right? Is that there is no distinction. That's the definition of fascism between government and corporations. You're seeing power grabs that are completely typical of closed societies, but completely uncharacteristic of open democracies. So everyone is scared, and I just want to say I'm scared too, right? Fear makes us not think clearly. Fear makes us think with our reptile brain, the amygdala, and not with the prefrontal cortex, which can analyze and have some distance. So I am here to remind you, please, to use your prefrontal cortex in thinking through what's happening right now, because what I'm going to tell you is that we are being misinformed about precedent when it comes to how free societies have managed infectious diseases. We're being told that this is a quarantine, right? I'm going to show you in my essay that that word is being misused. It's not a quarantine, it's something else. Historically, I'm going to argue there is no precedent for this in open societies. There's lots of precedent in closed societies. And then before I begin, I just want to quickly recap what I said in the other two videos and in my essay for those who missed it. I wrote a book in 2008 called The End of America. And in this book, I warned that what George Bush was putting into place was the 10 steps from a fascist playbook that would close an open democracy if we did not intervene. He was not alone. It's not a partisan issue. Obama built up that fascist edifice with all kinds of encroachments on liberties, from putting Americans on a death list and killing them through extrajudicial killings, Anwar al-Awlaki and his son, to a war on whistleblowers, to surveillance state, and that in turn, and the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which gives any president the power to detain and hold anyone without charge or trial. So the reason not to have laws like that is that someday someone bad will get into office and will use those powers. So a lot of people don't like Trump. A lot of people do. This is a nonpartisan video. Trump has that power to detain anyone without charge or trial. We're seeing arbitrary detention and release, which is one of the steps of Step 10 in Portland. We're seeing militias in the streets, which is another hallmark of a closing society. We're seeing the declarations that the rule of law doesn't matter. That is Step 10, when you end the rule of law. And what I'm trying to tell you in this video is that for 13 years, I promised people who read The End of America, and now its prequel, Outrages, which explains how these powers were invented in the first place in the 19th century. But I promised my readers that when things got really bad, I would tell them, or else they would know they were so bad because I would stop talking. So this is my video that I never wanted to create, in which I'm telling you that we are here. It is Step 10, and if we don't become laser focused on the rule of law and learning ourselves about the structures of our democracies in the next, literally weeks, because we don't have months, then it will be too late. And when I say it will be too late, I mean what's happening right now is that, and it's so typical of this point of a closing democracy, what's happening right now is that Democrats and citizens are on Twitter or in Congress saying, oh no, you can't do that. That's not right. That's really appalling. And Mussolini counted on this. The legislators in the Italian parliament kept legislating. They kept meeting. They kept saying, no, we'll pass a vote. And meanwhile, Mussolini was assembling his his black shirts in groups at the voting booths. He was beating up and intimidating legislators, and it was over. So they were still doing the democratic dance when the fascist playbook was already underway. And that's where we're at. It's already too late. And what I said in the last video is, it's not too late to take positive action, but it's too late if you keep thinking we're in a functioning democracy here in the United States. You're making a fatal mistake. We're more in what is a civil war on citizens and on democracy. We just don't realize that we're at war. So very fast forward, and I really want to stress, I call for peaceful action. One of the things that's being set as a trap is the instigation of violence on both sides. In order to save our democracy, we have to be completely non-violent. That Trump is creating traps of whipping up violence on both sides, and then he's going to say, look, things are so unstable, things are so violent, we have to have emergency decrees. There can't be a counting of the votes in the normal way. There can't be the rule of law. That's my prediction for what's going to unfold closer to the election. According to history, I'm going to tell you, and you're not going to like it, but I have to tell you and be honest, in the next few weeks, and I already started predicting this, and it's already coming true as I predicted, and it's not because I am a Cassandra or psychic, it's because these steps in a closing society are 100% characteristic. You can count on them. There will be more and more instability. There will be more and more instigation of violence. There will be more and more spectacular violence, right? It ratchets up and ratchets up. This is in part theater, because people who want to grab power, and both the left and the right is now in this fascist power grab. They do it by creating spectacles of instability, but more of the spectacle is coming from Trump. You're going to see power outages. I said you were going to see communications being difficult, internet outages. Electricity is going to go out. If you have a generator, hang on to it. And I'm not a prepper, but because literally the things that make us comfortable and that make business as usual, that allow us to think, those will be disrupted, because what people who are creating a bid for power want is a population that's in shock, that's disoriented, where more and more, faster and faster news of more and more spectacular instability is assaulting them on all sides. Military call that tenderizing the enemy, and that is where we are. So we need to meditate, we need to stay clear, we need to stay nonviolent, and we need to focus on strengthening ourselves, our families, our communities, and our nation, and the rule of law in a very peaceful, concentrated way, to not be swept into the chaos that is going to lead to the end of our democracy. So now let me go to step 10, the essay. And this is what I want to tell you. So I said that we're being given a euphemism that allows for the various power grabs, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, it is a real pandemic. I really wear a mask. I'm really sitting here in the middle of the woods. You know, I really think everyone should wear a mask in public places. But what I'm going to be explaining now is that no pandemic has unfolded, even including very fatal ones, with the state controlling people's movements rather than people voluntarily controlling their own movements. There are some restrictions in the past, but never anything like this. Okay, so this is totally unprecedented. So national leaders are using the term quarantine to refer to acts of closing down economic activity in whole states and even nations, and of restricting all citizens' travel to and from entire state lines or across borders to countries. And this quarantine has in turn shut down engines of economic activity. So I really want to stress, I know this is valuable medically, right? I don't doubt that this is valuable medically. You know, if we had shut down all of society with the Spanish flu, lives would have been saved. If we had shut down all of society with tuberculosis before it was treatable, lives would have been saved. If we had kept people with AIDS separate from the rest of humanity, no doubt some lives would have been saved. But at that point, everyone who proposed such an appalling, unthinkable thing was assailed, as they should have been, with attacks for that being inhumane and a restriction of civil liberties, right? So I don't doubt that lives are saved when all of society is shut down by the state and complete economic engines are shut down by the state. I'm not disputing that, but I'm saying that we really need to ask if when this pandemic ends, if the way that lives have been saved will leave us without any liberties at all. So my concern here is that looking at what we risk forever in the heat of our medically valid fears. So I want to point out quarantine is a serious historical misuse of what's happening now. So leaders have rolled out messaging about this form of immobilizing citizens as if it's a quarantine. And this is kind of, it sounds really cozy, almost like, oh, just stay home. We've done it before. This has precedent, but it really doesn't have any precedent. It's quite novel to lock down the economic engine of a whole society. And for Western democracies, it's a new social experiment on this scale. Our global and nation-by-nation lockdown really doesn't look like any disease-related quarantines in history at all. This large-scale forced closure by the state of businesses and the cordoning off of complete societies. And by the way, in Australia, people say they're under house arrest. I mean, whole residential buildings have guards restricting movements, right? With movements of both healthy and infected citizens restricted by the state is something other than historical quarantine altogether. So this lockdown, as we're experiencing it, has actually happened before on this planet, just not in open societies or in the contemporary West. Totalitarian and fascist societies have indeed often used mass restrictions of movement, curfews, and other ways of restricting the free association and free movement of citizens. And remember, the First Amendment of the Constitution talks about freedom to assemble, right? Freedom of assembly is absolutely paramount for a free society. I am acknowledging that it is risky and medically dangerous and people should mobilize voluntarily to stay home, right? But when the state restricts freedom of movement, something completely different has happened to a free society, making it a closed society. North Korea and China have indeed utilized the cordoning off of entire regions and put them under no movement rules for everyone. The Chinese Communist Party, long before the COVID pandemic, was among few modern societies to restrict citizens' physical movements nationally and regionally, and that's city metric. I've cited all of these in my essay, and I'll post all the citations in the essay. As dissidents escapees from North Korea report, North Korean nationals have also long been unable to move freely around their country without proper documentation, even for family visits. Now, Europe is not immune to this restriction of movement in the past. It has seen such regional and national, quote, lockdown too, but that was in countries that suffered from fascist leadership. In 1935-36, for instance, the passports of Jews in Germany were restricted, and that's from the British Library. Eventually, restrictions on leaving the country would keep Jewish Germans from escaping altogether. From 1939 to 1941, laws imposing various increasing restrictions on the movements of Jews put members of the Jewish community into effective lockdown as citizens within the larger German society. And by the way, infection, and it's real infection right now, I do not doubt that, but infection as a metaphor was a frequent trope used by anti-Semitic literature about the threat of Jews intermingling with Aryans. And indeed, if you look back to the origin of the state managing contagious diseases, which I write about in Outrages, my new book, which was canceled on publication last year and is out now by Chelsea Green, you will see that managing contagion in the 1840s and 1850s was a really successful experiment in which the state persuaded citizens to yield their bodies basically to the state. But back to the 20th century. These laws prevented Jews from entering certain neighborhoods and from traveling on buses. Walled Jewish residential areas called ghettos were often traditional in European cities, but state-mandated restrictions during the Nazi occupations turned them into residential prisons. So on 16th of November 1940, the gates were closed to the Warsaw Ghetto, a community of 400,000 people, thus making it impossible for the Jewish inhabitants to earn livelihoods. This closure and denial of the power of earning a living was instrumental in the weakening of potential resistance on the parts of victims of this segregation. So I just want you to notice that when you restrict citizens' movements and forbid them to make a living, again, it may have a wonderful medical or epidemiological result, but you are also making them much weaker if you want to do other bad things to them, right? Or if you want to exploit that crisis to do bad things like stripping their liberties or grabbing the whole economy. But large-scale totalitarian-style restrictions of citizens' movements by the state are new to the post-war democratic West and unheard of in actual open societies. Even past pandemics have not been excuses in such societies to venture into this drastic territory. What is quarantine understood correctly? It's not this. Medical quarantine itself, as the term is properly understood, has a long and often effective history. The OED defines quarantine as, quote, a period originally of 40 days, during which persons who might serve to spread a contagious disease are kept isolated from the rest of the community, especially a period of detention imposed on travelers or voyagers before they are allowed to enter a country or town and mix with the inhabitants. And so typically it's a period when a ship, which was usually the way contagion came into new ports before the 20th century. Ships were kept isolated on its arrival at a port. So society-wide shutdown and the closing down of all economic activity are definitely not part of the OED's definition of quarantine. Some historians of science refer to quarantine as a primitive technology. And again, I really want to stress throughout this essay, Quarantine is medically valuable. Obviously, I'm not an epidemiologist. I have no quarrel with the practice of quarantine if it protects civil liberties. But I am saying over and over that what we are facing is not quarantine, okay? A. A. Conti, in Quarantine Through History, notes that, quote, quarantine is overall one of the oldest and most disseminated and, despite its limits, most effective health measures elaborated by mankind. And in the centuries before germ theory was understood and before vaccines, quarantine, that is, physical isolation of infected people, was indeed among the few methodologies societies had to manage terrifying outbreaks of suffering and of death. So, quarantine has virtually always meant the restriction of movement for those who are ill or possibly infected, but not of everyone, and I can't say this enough. The term has often meant isolating travelers till they can be guaranteed to be healthy and then letting them pass into the larger, unrestricted society into which they wish to travel. And it has often meant putting infected people on an island together, for instance, or outside of camp, or in a, quote, fever hospital, until they either got better or else died. And again, I'm not saying that was fun. That was a tragic experience, but that's what quarantine was before modern medicine. But quarantines in history overwhelmingly describe other kinds of much more specific restrictions than the wholesale restriction of movement and economic activity of healthy and ill that we are experiencing. So the isolation of the infected members of a community has an ancient history. Ill people are isolated throughout the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Leviticus has detailed prescriptions about how to handle the dreaded contagion of leprosy. The leper has to call out unclean, unclean. That's Leviticus 13:45. P. Grisser, writing in the Jewish newspaper The Forward, adds the example of Moses telling Israel's to place outside of camp anyone with an eruption or a discharge. And then Leviticus 15:19 goes into a lot of detail about how you handle this contagious person. You treat him as unclean all day long. If he has discharges or is blocked up from the discharge, you don't handle his bedding. Anywhere he sits is unclean. Anyone who touches his bed shall wash his garments, bathe in water, and be unclean till evening. So there's this like detailed focus, which sounds very familiar, wash your hands, on separating the source of infection from the rest of the community. And it was understood that people with contagion could defile the rest of the community. And in fact, very interestingly to me as a Jewish person, some analysts of the origin of the rules about kashrut, meaning what's fit and unfit, what's holy and not holy, believe that it has to do with sanitary practices in the era before modern medicine. So in contrast to this, in the New Testament, the woman with the issue of blood, Matthew 9:20-22, is seen as an outcast because she has an infectious disease, an issue of blood. And menstruating women were seen as unclean, but women with discharges were seen as unclean. And people were so isolated by contagious diseases or illnesses that were visible that it was radical that Jesus welcomed her into the community. So the fact is that in the modern era, illness is not public, right? But the state has decided that COVID infection is a matter that strips you of privacy. So there are many apparatuses being brought to bear on tracking and managing your illness status. And this, is a sharp contrast to the fierce debates over revealing, disclosing, or protecting the privacy of people infected with HIV in the 1980s. And society came to the same conclusion that these were private matters, right? And that you did not have a right, the state did not have a right to out someone's HIV status, to trace their HIV status. And the same thing is true going back into the 20th century. Part of a free society is having privacy, right? Your privacy isn't radically compromised because someone could make the case that you pose a fatal threat to the community. So with coronavirus, illness can be justified as being messaged as a public matter, as in the pre-modern past, and certainly one that gives the state a central role, and thus a high status and a great deal of authority in managing our bodies. So temperatures are taken in front of strangers, announcements of the infections of public figures on social media. COVID's lethality is being used to explain why, whether we are sick or well, we should all abandon any expectations of privacy and autonomy. And again, a sharp contrast to how the HIV epidemic played out. By the same reasoning, all of the people who were infected should have been outed and separated and, stigmatized, and their potential sexual partners notified and traced on contact tracing, and the management of all of that given to the state. But that rightly didn't happen. People's privacy was respected. The community warned people about unsafe practices. The community changed, it learned about unsafe practices, took care of their physical safety, and it was a horrible, tragic event. But the wholesale civil liberties of people infected with HIV were not stripped from them. And that too was a sometimes fatal disease that you could not tell from looking. Okay, a lot of people, after I first posted this essay yesterday, were raising the question of people who are symptomatic with COVID and not visibly infectious. And I'm just saying that is bad. I agree, we need to be very, very careful. But the difference between the community encouraging people to engage in safe practices, as we did in the 80s, versus the state wholesale tracking and tracing and disclosing and managing you on the basis of your body is very, very stark. In the past, we were all, infection did strip privacy and autonomy from infected people before the 20th century. But with the messaging around COVID by the state, we're all being positioned as hypothetically ill and continually told that we should act as if we're potentially infected. And we should, but the state is using that as a justification for stripping away all of our rights to privacy and autonomy. By the way, if you have a COVID test at Rite Aid, HIPAA doesn't protect you anymore. You have to log into Rite Aid on Google. Google has terms and conditions that I read when a loved one took that test that has you give up your right to privacy, and the data can be sold according to the terms and conditions to third parties. So your privacy is done, right? Your DNA is gone. It's public. You have no right to privacy with Rite Aid's HIPAA tests. And when I called Rite Aid and said, why are you not obeying HIPAA privacy law, they said, we're helping the government. And they didn't have an answer as to why the sign-in was on Google, handing over your data to Google. The downside of this, beyond its potential medical value, which I acknowledge, is that this can create a public category of second-class citizens whose bodies are going to determine their potential in life. And all of us can be managed soon by the threat of losing options due to what we do or don't have in our bodies. I'm going to skip ahead about the way that school children in Massachusetts are not being allowed to go back to school unless they've had flu vaccines. I am not an anti-vaxxer. I believe in science. I believe in vaccine. But I want to clearly say that the way the state is usurping the role of parents in deciding the medical treatment of children in order to allow them to go to public school is a gigantic, I want you to move away from the question of is this or is this not a good idea medically, and go to the larger question, because maybe it is, right? Go to the larger question. This is not coronavirus vaccines, which don't exist yet. It's flu vaccines, right? Massachusetts is saying your child has to have this in their body before they can come to school. I vaccinate my kids. I have vaccines. I am not an anti-vaxxer, but I want you to think big picture, that for the state to say that, it is literally a hair's breadth than for the state to say how many kids you can have, whether you need to be neutered or have your tubes tied, forced sterilization, DNA manipulation, all the different ways that the state can and will mediate your body and your kid's body if we let this kind of power grab under the fear and distress and instability of coronavirus. Right? Parents in a free society decide the medical treatment of children. Quarantines were used by various communities in the Middle Ages, of course, as the Black or bubonic plague wiped out millions of people in Europe in the 14th and 16th and finally at the end of the 19th century. This is the origin of the term quarantine. It comes from quarantina, the 40 days that travelers were isolated, as I mentioned. So the Black Plague killed 2/3 of the people in Europe, and authorities removed sick people to plague hospitals, later called fever hospitals, as I mentioned. And I mentioned also islands of the infected. There's a mass grave on a Venetian island, which could be called the first disease quarantine colony, called a lazaret. And these islands were part of how Venice managed to survive wave after wave of pandemic or epidemic, waves of plague. When the plague struck the town, everyone sick or showing any sign of a suspected symptom were restricted on the island till they recovered or died, says the anthropologist Luisa Gambaro. So again, it would not have been fun. And I sailed to one of those islands, and it is absolutely haunted, and it would have been a terrible thing. But as distressing and tragic as it is to separate the ill, Venice as a whole did not stop its entire economic activity or keep healthy Venetians indoors along with the ill. In the 1620s and 1630s, Britain quarantined ships, but again, Britain did not bring its marketplaces to a standstill or keep healthy people inside with those who were sick. And that is arrival from abroad, plague quarantine, and concepts of contagion in 18th century England. Plague was severe in Britain several times in the 17th century, and if you read a journal of the plague year, the account of the great visitation of plague to London in 1665, Daniel Defoe, a journalist and a trader, describes London slowly realizing that the plague is stalking the city. Again, authorities closed off neighborhoods. Rich people fled to the country, as they're doing now to the Hamptons. And houses were closed off, and neighborhoods were closed off if there was proven plague in that area. But all of London was not closed off. The engine of economic activity was not shut down in this terrible plague. He describes bills of deaths, very much like the coronavirus bulletins from Governor Cuomo in New York. He describes the downtown of London as like a ghost town, and the face of it altered by mass flight, the way the face of New York is altered. I went to the city a couple of days ago. It's completely changed, right? But orders of sequestration were sent out. They were shutting up people's houses. Hackney coaches had rules. If they transported a sick person, they had to be well aired and left uninhabited for 5 or 6 days. Group gatherings were understood to communicate the plague. Plays, feasting, and taverns were all limited. But again, you're going to hear me say this over and over, the engine of London's economy again did not shut down. The whole city, healthy inhabitants and ill, did not shut down. And London eventually emerged from the plague. Quarantine practices arrived in America in the same form they'd taken in Europe. In other words, not like this one. Isolation of the sick, not lockdown of everyone. Thousands of people died in waves of yellow fever in the United States in 1793 and 1798, and in response, Philadelphia's town fathers created what they called from the Italian a lazaretto, a hospital where the infected were taken to isolate together. Though the cause of yellow fever, which is mosquitoes, was not yet understood, the hospital was effective. Ships, too, were isolated further from shore. But in this example of quarantine, all of Philadelphia, as you can say it with me, economic activity was not shut down, and the movements of all its citizens, healthy along with infected, were not restricted. So I mentioned the 19th century as a breakthrough century for the state managing infectious diseases. There were cholera and typhus epidemics in London in the 1830s and 1840s, which Londoners attributed to miasmas or bad air. And These were horrible epidemics. They felled thousands, and people were dying in swift and grotesque ways. Someone would be well on Tuesday and on Thursday at death's door, and Friday gone. Physician John Snow was able to prove in 1854 that cholera was spread by infected water, and this led to a major municipal effort, the building of an underground network of sewers, a huge public health triumph. But this innovation, when the state stepped in to manage infectious material, and in this case what was infecting people was human waste and infected water, and to regulate the commons, this was the turning point. And I write about this in Outrages, Sex Censorship and the Criminalization of Love. This was a huge lesson, a huge test that was successful for the modern state, because, and it's influential to this day, we're seeing the outcomes, because this formative public health victory left us as modern people in secular open societies with assumptions about the power and scope and role of the state. We assume from this history, I'd argue, that the modern state has the primary role of managing and cleansing the commons and managing the networks and thoroughfares that connect us. And we still think of the ways in which we are connected in terms of vulnerability to infectious diseases. We think of ideas and influences that infect the young or vulnerable or impressionable. So with this public health triumph in the 19th century that I go into detail in the book Outrages, again, which was pulled from shelves, librarians were told to cancel it, to destroy it last spring. It's now available. It's got this chapter on infectious diseases, and that it became common to legislate based on the metaphor of, quote, infection of the community by way of people and even of words and ideas. So this fear of contagion was used in anti-gay hysteria with the HIV panic in the 80s. Pornography has been called filth that has to be cleaned up lest it infect people. So infectious diseases, the state learned that this gave demagogues a real scare vocabulary and a real opening to push through other forms of social control. And by the way, that's what my book is about, the new book, which is, you can read it as a prequel to The End of America. It's how the state managed to invent huge systemic ways to control populations in the 19th century in what was nominally an open, free democracy, or reasonably free democracy. So again, let's look at the late 19th century. What happened when there were terrible fatal diseases stalking democracies? Tuberculosis, before it was treated in the 20th century more effectively, was a terrible, invisible, infectious, fatal disease, often fatal. It was very much like coronavirus, in that you pick it up through people's breath, through surfaces that they've handled, through body fluids. So in the late 19th century, wealthy people with tuberculosis regularly exiled themselves to luxurious sanatoria or rest homes. Poet and critic John Addington Symonds, tubercular his whole adult life, he died of the illness at 53, made his home in Davos for just that reason. He's the hero of Outrages. It was becoming a destination for affluent tubercular expatriates, but they were not locked into their homes, right? They were free to remove themselves from society. The Magic Mountain, of course, published by Thomas Mann in 1924, describes Hans Castorp's visit to a cousin at a similar luxurious sanatorium for tuberculosis patients in Davos. So into the 1920s, people walking around with horribly infectious, fatal diseases were not locked down alongside healthy people by the mandate of the state. They self-exiled themselves. They isolated themselves for treatment. The need to isolate sick people for treatment and recovery, and to give them the chance to recover, was so obvious by the end of the 19th century that state-funded rest homes and sanatoria were established for people of other classes, people who weren't affluent. So both D.H. Lawrence and George Orwell self-isolated in such sanatoria. In 1947, a badly tubercular Orwell was advised to enter a sanatorium for 4 months for vitamins, fresh air, and being confined to bed. Again, he was not locked into his home with everyone else. He was not mixed in with his community by order of the state. He was not checked at checkpoints to see if he was tubercular. He was encouraged by his doctor to self-isolate and provided by the state with the means to do so and to be treated and to get better, hopefully. So we should look again at this idea of rest homes. But because right now, people in America who are sick are locked down with the healthy. Our infection rates are off the charts. We don't have free medical care, and people are dying, right? But people who are sick or who might be sick have nowhere to go that's free for the state to support them and look after them, treat them, give them nutritious food, isolate them from the rest of society voluntarily, right? We are locked down, healthy and sick. And many of the sick people are not visibly symptomatic. And so this mixing of healthy and sick, which is totally atypical, right, of quarantines past, is leading to spikes and spikes and spikes. What there isn't is what there has been in the past, what there was, during the HIV crisis, what there was during the crisis of tuberculosis and the Spanish flu. There isn't a voluntary campaign to voluntarily encourage people to self-isolate and to give them the resources, or to engage in safe sex practices in the case of HIV, to give them the resources, the help, the support, the medical treatment, the drugs, and so on, to address the pandemic, address the infectious diseases, right? But never before has a whole society been locked down. Whatever national policies our leaders create in this pandemic, it's important that we not be misled. Staying home sick with well and statewide or nationally restricted movement is not a time-honored medical practice, but a drastic social experiment which has been tried at scale only in closed societies. And again, I really want to say, I'm aware that wholesale restriction of movements of people in a pandemic is likely to save lives. And I think people should voluntarily restrict their movement and not have large gatherings and avoid large gatherings and wear masks. I really want to be clear about that. The difference is who is making the decision. Never, ever, ever in a quarantine has a whole society been, quote unquote, locked down, restricted by force. Let me add one other thing. In the furor and upset and fear and isolation caused by lockdown, what is absolutely happening in a number of major democracies is that new policies and laws are being put in place while we're at home and can't really look into it, or do anything about it, that will mean that when we surface, there will be no more democracy. That's what's happening. You see it in Australia. Parliament was disbanded, right, at the beginning of the lockdown. They didn't continue to meet on telecommunication platforms. And then when they reconvened, as I mentioned, an unelected cabal of coal interests and industrialists with no accountability to the people was given a great deal of decision-making power. In New York City, where I used to live before coming here in the pandemic, I am aware that in the middle of the worst and scariest time in March and April, our governor, Andrew Cuomo, for whom I voted, said that he was going to appoint a committee, and this is very much like the appointed committee, unelected committee in Australia of rich guys, and in that committee there was going to be Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg and, some tech guys. Like a bunch of billionaires were going to be the COVID committee. That's exactly what they did in Australia, right? But that they would have decision making about a bunch of other stuff unrelated to coronavirus, and they're not medical experts. So there was an outcry about that, but that was their intention, right? That was his intention, and they succeeded in Australia. Again, I can't stress this enough. In Australia, on social media, people are videoing, little old ladies who are not wearing masks, sitting peacefully in isolation with each other on a park bench, being harassed and having their phones taken away forcibly and intimidated by police. Forcible detention and release, I told you about that. That's happening when people violate curfew, right? It's even happening in New Zealand, which is a model democracy in many ways. People are being arrested for violating curfew. In New York City, a curfew was rolled out after there was looting. That's a gigantic restriction of our civil liberties. Again, ostensibly, why coronavirus? In Britain, as I mentioned, new enabling clauses are being inserted into the democratic process to bypass Parliament. I can't stress this enough. You can go on and on. We actually read the coronavirus bill in March that Parliament was proposing. It was the very beginning of the pandemic, of the lockdown. Nobody knew what was ahead, but I tweeted about this, I wrote about it. In March of 2020, when no one knew what was going to lie ahead, one of the things the coronavirus bill did was suspend elections for the whole year of 2020, not reconvene till 2021, and suspend elections in Northern Ireland till 2030. Why? At that point, they didn't even know that we would not be going to the polls in 2020 or 2021. In the United States, the election is in danger of being completely subverted because of coronavirus. And we're mailing in our votes because people can't assemble or won't assemble, understandably. And as a result, there's this prospect of the vote not being determined. There's going to be challenge and counter-challenge. I've warned about this. And then militias and violence in around the counting of the vote. That's my prediction. And then that allows Trump to say, it's too unstable, I'm not leaving. There has to be emergency law for everybody's sake. So I just want to say, rights are being stripped from people around the world. I'm in touch with people on a tech platform who have not been allowed out of their apartments, not even to exercise, or allowed out for an hour to exercise. These are not free societies. This is not what happens even in an appalling epidemic with horrible contagious diseases, which we've had before in an open society. And this doesn't happen in an open society because by definition, it's not an open society. If you're doing that, please disregard my phone, which I forgot to turn off. I'll just let it go. So I really want you to think, public assembly is not just a vector of transmitting illness. It is also that right now, and we all have to be very careful and conscientious. But it's also the place that democracy happens. If you're a reporter, you can't investigate if you can't meet a source in private, right? It's all forced onto Zoom. That's the most hackable platform in the world. It is a third-party platform. There's no privacy. If you're an elected official, you can't have a mobilization of support for for a vote that's unpopular with special interests if everything is happening remotely. If you are a protest movement, it's very easy with masks for instigators and infiltrators to create violence or to provoke violence and create another excuse for a crackdown. And so what I'm warning you is that this pandemic, as serious as it is being treated in a completely unprecedented way in an open society. And what I'm seeing is that, people are starting to say, when will they let us out? In an open society, they don't let us out. We decide, right? In a democracy, we decide how we as a community manage emergencies and crises. The last thing I want to leave you with, and I'm going to do a whole video on this, is that the data are not verifiable. A lot of the media is using only a few coronavirus data tracking sites, and if you try to see the data sets, they're not available by their terms and conditions. This is true, for instance, of the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Tracking Project. So, and others are inflated in the case of blue states. For instance, Oregon was including anyone presenting with cough and fever as a COVID case. I'm not making this up. The governor said so. The press release said so. Whereas in Florida, a whistleblower said a red state, they're hiding the spikes. So if we can't trust the data, all the more reason to be super cautious, get the best information we can, do everything we should medically, but know that this pandemic is being used as a cover for what step 10 is, or as an opportunity for exploitation by tyrants. And I'm just going to end by saying, will this lockdown of everyone solve the problem of COVID infections? It doubtless medically helps to contain the pandemic. But absolute medical safety is sometimes in a paradoxical relationship to the basic demands of a free society. We really should not be afraid to ask how long and with what severity, based on what data, tolerating what intrusions and trackings of the body, and at what other set of costs. As others have pointed out, there seems to be no exit strategy from this crisis to regain the public spaces and democratic processes in which democracy takes place. When will it be safe enough? What is that benchmark? Given how great COVID-19 policies are for those who hate democracy and profit from its demise, I am warning that at this point it is unlikely ever to be deemed by our leaders safe enough to resume a full democracy. Medical reality and even a potential for full recovery of our collective health from this pandemic notwithstanding. They like these powers. They are not going to give them back voluntarily if we get better, right? Not unless we do some hard independent thinking about how we make decisions as a community. Surely we must start to discuss COVID-related policies in a free society that are predicated on prioritizing public health, but that do not subject citizens in unprecedented ways to violations of basic rights of movement and association and privacy. Nationwide restrictions of all citizens, healthy and ill, restrictions of citizens' movements, exposure of their private data, management of their bodies by the state, and suppression of all economic activity have indeed been used in the past. But these edicts on this scale have not been used in the past to solve the problem of infectious diseases. Rather, they have been used in the past to solve the problem of democracy itself. So thank you for listening. This is Naomi Wolf. The book is The End of America, Letters of Warning to a Young Patriot, which I basically updated just now, and the prequel, which is out now after having been canceled and pulled from shelves last spring, is called Outrages, Sex, Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love. And you should read them as a prequel and then a modern warning, and now this 3-part series, and this essay is my third update to this process of stripping us of our civil liberties. So let's see any questions or comments. Paid trolls are in force. I'm sorry to hear that. Darlene says she's conveying what a fascist society looks like, drawing lines within our current society and hoping to protect a complete fascist takeover. That is true, Darlene. Not COVID-19 policies and procedures. Thank you so much for saying that. I can't say that enough. You are right. People keep asking, and it's the wrong question to ask. What's your medical recommendation? What's the medical policy? That's a symptom. That's medical policy should flow out of a strong democracy. It should not be imposed by totalitarians, even if it's great epidemiology. So I want you first to regain society and regain democracy and fear totalitarian power grabs, and the medical decisions that flow out of that will be informed by science and transparency. Patsy says, OFFS, more hysteria. We take precautions because we're trying to do the right thing. I'm glad you're taking precautions because you're trying to do the right thing, not because some government someplace says anything. The fascist is in the White House, and he apparently wants folks to get sick. I won't play. Well, what Trump did in not disclosing the dangers of coronavirus is extraordinarily serious as well, and that's another fascist play. Infecting populations. I mean, no one should be playing politics with a pandemic. No one should be restricting liberties with a pandemic that are unprecedented, that the people don't choose. Asymptomatics only pass in incredibly rare circumstances. Melbourne, Australia hears you. I'm glad to hear it because some of the scariest updates I'm getting are from people in Australia who literally are being policed in ways like I've often said recently that I see Australia as a petri dish, and it's where these oligarchs are testing how to close down freedoms in what is nominally an advanced secular industrial democracy. And I've watched Australian democracy be shredded and torn up and, you know, defiled in just the year and a half since I've been watching closely, and especially since the fires. And then I know it's so disturbing when they decide to let you in behind huge plastic shields. So cold, so disturbing. Well, the huge plastic shields are important, but again, it's what people choose to do. Adolfo Rosado said, massive peaceful march on D.C., say 3 to 4 million. That's a super spreader event right there. Make a statement and request the existing body of government to vacate. D.C. must become a normal state, and the currency needs to be managed by the Treasury and not a central bank. That's another issue. So, hey, Donald Jeffries, good to see you. One of my heroes, Don Jeffries. You guys have to read his books. Yeah, Joe Downey is a great reader of mine. He's saying, all I can think about is your grandmother, the wonderful Professor Faye Goldman, may she rest in peace, who kept saying that happened in Germany, that happened in Germany. You spoke of this in one of your speeches. You're absolutely right. Thank you for paying such close attention, Joe. I appreciate it. I'm Jewish. You know, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust refugees. Many of my aunts and uncles, great aunts and great uncles, did not survive the Holocaust. I don't say it lightly when I repeat that something happened in Germany. You know, Hitler learned from Mussolini. Stalin learned from Hitler and Mussolini. You know, Pinochet learned from those guys. These 10 steps, we teach them in the School for the Americas. This is a playbook, and restricting movement, restricting free assembly is key. I mean, why does the First Amendment say freedom to assemble, right? Really think about it. Why do you need freedom to assemble? Because if you are locked in by the state instead of minding the health of one another in a community with some, you know, reasonable public health measures to not have parties, not congregate, if you're controlled so absolutely that you can't leave your home or can't leave a building, which is happening in countries around the world, it is very, very easy for oligarchs to take everything, to take all the stuff. Nobody's watching. Nobody's reporting. Nobody's investigating. Judges can barely preside over courts. It's a complete tenderizing of a society for a takeover. Joe says, oh, love the Hudson Valley. Yes, that's a happy thing. Donald Jeffries says that this lockdown will cause incalculable damage to us both economically and socially. You know, I'm starting to hear people say a relative died of isolation, or people in hospitals are saying people are coming in, elders are coming in dying of starvation. People are dying of depression. The train up here was stopped because someone phoned in a suicide threat and put his head on the tracks, and they were looking for the body while I was on the train. I mean, it is a terrifying pandemic, and loss of hope is also terrifying. This is how journals sound in the early days of a closed society. People giving up, people losing hope, people turning inward. So let's really keep the big picture in mind, even as we take all the right steps to protect ourselves and our neighbors. I really want people to hear both those statements. A lot of Arabic, which I don't read. Yeah, Darlene is super thoughtful. We've taken our democratic processes for granted so long and get swept up in general elections like it's going to solve everything. The system is broken. Getting caught up in polarization just erodes our unity, I think you're going to say. Adolfo Rosado said they just sabotaged high-volume mail sorting machines. I am not surprised. The fatal mistake is not organizing and protesting, says Karen Stefanski Pascal. Why are you leading protests? People need, I think you mean, why am I not leading protests? People need to be out in the streets, not so much now, but as soon as we defeat Trump. I hear you, and I'm a big believer in protests. But I'm warning you that protest has been effectively emasculated by now. And at this point in a closing democracy, people need to start being arrested. Basically, there need to be criminal prosecutions of those who are breaking the law at the highest levels on both sides. Speak out and speak up, people. What can we do as individual citizens, says Steve Martin. Is there an alliance of journalists that you know of that recognize what you speak of? Oh dear. I mean, unfortunately, social media and now journalism has become so polarized that, and so stupid, that it's very hard to have this kind of nuanced conversation, because the minute you ask questions, anyone who is asking questions about the way lockdown is unfolding is branded as a conspiracy theorist or an anti-vaxxer or a Republican, which I certainly am not, or a Trump cultist or QAnon, etc., etc. So we've lost the space for thoughtful debate. Unfortunately, I'm trying to have it here with you guys on Facebook Live. I was locked out of Facebook Live for months and months. Just recently regained it. So I don't know of a journalistic organization that is speaking up about this. I think people are really scared to say, hey, wait, what about our civil liberties? And honestly, until I did the research into what quarantine has looked like in the past, I wasn't confident saying that there's something anomalous about this. It's really presented as fully traditional, and it wasn't until I had the confidence in seeing that, well, no, they didn't do it here, they didn't do it with the Black Plague, they didn't do it with tuberculosis, they didn't do it with cholera, they didn't do it with typhus. Only then was I really sure that, this is not business as usual, this is not okay. It's not historically precedented. The public, Eric Geschke, is completely right. The public has been conditioned to abdicate critical thinking in favor of simplistic left-right tribalist thinking, questioning coronavirus restrictions. And I really want to stress, I believe in restrictions. I don't believe in restrictions by the state. I believe in behavioral change the way the LGBT community so beautifully, and everyone supporting them, managed a very deadly crisis without the state intervening in the private lives of people facing the possibility of an infectious disease, or the public lives for that matter. We need to restrict our behavior by ourselves. We need to restrict our behavior as a community. We need to take care of each other as a community, right? I don't want you to think I don't believe in that. President Trump should not be encouraging people to come to big rallies without wearing masks. That's very irresponsible. But the question is, who decides, right? Who decides? And in a free society, we should be deciding. And we should be deciding based on science. And we should be deciding in a way that we decide as a community, is this safe enough? How are we going to now create new policies for this level of infection? And by the way, what we don't have underlying all of this is solid data. Like, data scientists now are looking at the data for coronavirus and saying, this is not solid data. You can't check this data. Journalists, I'm so ashamed of my fellow journalists. Almost no one is looking at the data sets underlying these pronouncements of deaths and infections and saying, what's the methodology? Which is just a fancy word for, what questions did you ask to decide that this was a coronavirus death, or that this is a coronavirus infection? That's methodology. And what sources? So what are sources with data? Is it a hospital? Is it tests? Is it doctors? Is it health agencies? And when someone leaked me the actual data sets in a GitHub account for Johns Hopkins Bloomberg, which is one of the platforms that most reporters are using, only 6 states were reporting. So those are not complete data. And again, the terms and conditions of the Johns Hopkins site says that you can't look at the data and that it can't be taken as accurate. and equally bad or even worse flaws are with all the data of all the sites. So how do we know? Like, the job of journalists is not to take pronouncements, especially by platforms funded by investors and oligarchs and billionaires, right? They can hedge. I mean, something I'm really concerned about is these guys hedging the pandemic. A few rich people have made billions and billions of dollars. Jeff Bezos, Bloomberg, Bill Gates, during the pandemic. How did they do that? Amazon is pretty clear. But again, if you look at the policies, they're so designed to, and we read the bills at Daily Clout, right? That's why I'm so sure about this. The bills are designed to kill mom and pop small businesses, right, as they did, and to hand over a gigantic share of the market to Amazon, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, the big guys. And that's exactly what happened. If you read the bills, none of the small businesses got enough money to survive in time. But big businesses got redefined as small business and handed billions and billions of dollars. And what kind of policy is this in New York State? When I went back to New York City, the landscape was completely changed because all those little quirky small businesses are gone. They died. All those little restaurants, all those little cafes, little boutiques, even like little shoemakers and little leather goods stores, they're gone. And what is in that real estate? Starbucks, TD Bank, Chase Bank, right? Those guys. And so I worry that the big coronavirus reporting sites like Bloomberg funded Johns Hopkins, if you are a rich guy and you just get to look at the numbers half an hour before they're made public, you can put a bet on those numbers and make billions of dollars. And it's something the SEC should look at because it's insider trading, but it's perfectly legal. You're just aware of pandemic numbers that you funded. So it's we're really looking at a power grab on many levels now. And on that note, you've been very patient. I should probably let you go. Thank you for listening. Again, it's Naomi Wolf. I'll keep talking to you because you seem to want me to give you my impression. The book is The End of America. It's a bit out of date, so I'm updating with these videos, but it has the basics, 10 Steps to Fascism. Again, it's a bipartisan thing. And the new book is Outrages, Sex, Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love. And in that, you'll see really how the state first experimented on populations to figure out and persuade us that it was the state's role to manage our bodies, manage the commons, and bring us to this fraught moment where I want to end you with hope, leave you with hope, where I do believe the power to save our democracy and our lives is in our hands, but only if we're really very peaceful, very alert, and very aware. Thank you so much. Take care. Be safe.